If you have questions or need to put anything in the chat, we'll be keeping an eye on that. The only other thing that we ask, and some of you heard this already, is for you to keep your microphone muted if you're not actively speaking. You will get a chance to speak for the Q&A portion. And feel free to have your camera on, turn your camera off, whatever's most comfortable for you. So without further ado, the four panelists we have for today, we're going to start with Lorne Bair, who is an antiquarian bookseller and proprietor of Lorne Bair Rare Books in Winchester, Virginia, a firm specializing in rare printed works relating to the history, art, and literature of American social movements, counterculture, and radical politics. He served on the Board of Governors of the ABAA and is the current director of CABS Minnesota, formerly the Colorado Antiquarian Bookseller Seminar, a one-week intensive course in the history and methodology of the antiquarian book trade. Next, we'll have Petrina Jackson, who will begin as the Leah Gellin Pourvu Executive Director of the Schlesinger Library and librarian for the Radcliffe Institute next week, I believe. It's already November 1st. She's currently the director of the Special Collections Research Center at Syracuse University Libraries, where she oversees the Belfer Audio Lab and Archive, university archives, and all curated collections. Before Syracuse, she's held positions at Iowa State University, University of Virginia's Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library, Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections at Cornell University. She has a BA in English from University of Toledo and an MA in English from Iowa State, a Master of Library and Information Sciences from Pitt. She's widely recognized leader in the field by her active roles within the Society of American Archivists and the American Library Association's Rare Books and Manuscripts section. Following Petrina, we will have Lizeth Ramírez, who joined the UCLA Library Special Collections curating team as librarian archivist for Los Angeles Communities and Cultures in March of 2019. Prior to UCLA, she was an archivist and reference librarian at the Orange Public Library and History Center in Orange, California. During her career, she's focused on local and underrepresented communities, working to center them and their stories in the archival record, as well as creating programming initiatives that celebrate their history. Born and raised in Southern California, her bilingual English-Spanish skills have facilitated her work with local diaspora communities with links to Latin America. Lizeth is currently a steering committee member of the Society of American Archivists Latin American and Caribbean Cultural Heritage Archive section. And last but not least for the panelists, we have Lisbet Tellefsen is an Oakland, California-based community archivist, collector, curator, and publisher. Her archives and collections range from Cuban posters to Black LGBT culture, to Angela Davis to the Black Panther Party. Her archives are oft used for academic research, and as an archival consultant, she has worked on numerous films, including Black Panther's Vanguard of the Revolution by Firelight Films, and Free Angela and All Political Prisoners by Reelside Productions. Her collections have been exhibited at the GLBT Historical Society, Yale's Beneke Library, SF MoMA, Oakland Museum, and more. Over 100 objects from her collections now reside in the permanent collections of SF MoMA, Oakland Museum of California, and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, with a dozen pieces from the Tellefsen collection featured in the Smithsonian's 2016 inaugural exhibit. A current exhibit inspired by her archive, Angela Davis Seize the Time, opened in September 2021 at the Zimmerelli Art Museum at Rutgers in New Jersey. So without further ado, we have Lorne Bair.
Hey everyone. I've got some prepared remarks, and I've tried to keep them fairly short because prepared remarks always seem to be the least interesting part of these things. And I hope that we have opportunity for plenty of conversation later on. First of all, let me offer thanks to the two Caits, Mitas and Coker, and my distinguished fellow panelists for putting this whole thing together, and to the ABAA, especially the members of its diversity committee, for sponsoring the work and providing a public platform. As a bookseller who's been engaged around questions of social justice and representation for most of his career, it's really gratifying to see the strides the bookselling community as a whole and groups like the ABAA and IOBA in particular have made in the past few years, recognizing not just that these issues exist, but that they have a direct impact on the rare book professions, not simply from the perspective of equity and inclusion, as if that weren't enough, but economics, relevancy, and viability. Real change is possible, it is happening, and events like this one are both evidence and cause of that fact. So thanks again to the organizers and to all of you who've joined us today for taking a Tuesday afternoon to join us. It's a real honor to be here. As the sole white guy, and also the only full-time bookseller among the panelists, I'm very conscious of the danger of my making declarative statements on the subject of diversity and inclusiveness. At the same time, I think it's deeply important that folks like me, who for better or worse still make up the majority of the antiquarian bookselling community, acknowledge that we have a stake and a voice in this issue, and that it be understood that we're the ones who'll need to do much of the hard work to make change happen. That said, I want to stress that I'm here in a spirit of humility, and whatever I have to say on the questions being addressed here should be, must be placed in deference to the perspectives offered by my eminently more experienced and better qualified co-panelists. I'll be speaking from the point of view of a bookseller, so most of my comments will have to do with bookselling. But I hope that the bookselling, curating, and collecting fields have enough in common that my comments will have some resonance for everyone here. I'd like to begin by making a statement and then immediately following it with a question. The statement is, the antiquarian book trade is too white, too male, too straight, too rich, and too focused on the work of straight, rich white men. All of which I believe to be true. The question is, what are we talking about when we talk about the antiquarian book trade? And the answer to that question depends very much on who and where you are. As a straight white man, a descendant, albeit a second generation outcast descendant of a blue blood New England family, a former member of the Board of Governors of the ABAA, someone who's invested nearly 30 years in attaining, however feebly, a reputation among his peers, I have a set of established notions about what constitutes real bookselling. A young woman of color in downtown Atlanta running her own highly successful online bookstore from her home has an entirely different set of notions about real bookselling. And the street bookseller making a good living selling books on the sidewalk in Manhattan has their own idea. And so does the bulk Amazon lister. And so does the scout who combs estate sales for books to wholesale on eBay, and so on. The antiquarian book trade is a mosaic of styles, approaches, and markets. They're all valid. They all have something to teach, and they all rely for success on their own kinds of hard-earned and hard-learned expertise. And I think we need to bear all this in mind anytime we have a discussion around representation in the book trade. Today, we're gathered under the aegis of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, an august and generally respected body of booksellers who mostly look like me. And we're gathered to discuss, among a number of other questions, how we make the book trade, or more broadly, the rare book professions, look less like me, which is a great discussion to have, but it comes with a grave margin for error. We are not the book trade. We're a small corner of it. And while we're right to be concerned that our association has failed to attract a more diverse and inclusive membership, we need to recognize that outreach doesn't consist of looking down from our perch and telling folks we'd be happy to have them if only they'd come to us. Outreach consists in reaching out, in acknowledging difference, embracing it, learning as much as we can from other folks who do what we do, but do it in ways we've perhaps failed to acknowledge as valid simply because they don't mesh with our own experience. This kind of opening up can be hard to accomplish for a self-defined community like ours, which by long established mutual consent, rarely looking outwards, has perhaps even well-meaningly anointed itself as the arbiter of what is important, of how business should be done, how and from what perspective books should be described, priced, and sold. But we have to open up. We have to reach out because these assumptions we've had about ourselves are no longer valid. Perhaps we never intended to be exclusionary, but we've become so, like it or not. And our survival as a trade depends on building bridges back to those whom we've excluded. That's a process that, if done properly and in the right spirit of humility, will force us to re-examine the origins of our assumptions about what real bookselling is, and to think about how we approach and market material that springs from cultures and ideologies that aren't our own, at least not by birthright, and embrace those cultures and ideologies in such a way that we do the material justice. But what I'm talking about is a wider, more generous, more inclusive tent and a large-scale reimagining of what this rare book business is all about, not just in terms of who gets to participate in it, but all its historical and cultural apparatus, from the language we use to describe our material to the way we interact at book fairs. A little later, I hope to have a chance to talk about a new pilot program we've begun at CABS, Minnesota. It's called the Diverse Voices Fellowship, and it's designed to introduce prospective booksellers from non-traditional backgrounds to the book trade, both through our week-long seminar and a 2-day field school in New York City. The ABAA has also launched a really promising paid internship program that will offer candidates from HBCUs a 10-week opportunity to learn the trade hands-on from ABAA booksellers. These kinds of initiatives are important, they're essential, but in the spirit of my foregoing remarks, they'll be far less meaningful if they're offered in the spirit of initiation rather than as opportunities for all parties to learn from each other. That give and take is going to be the essence of the salvation of our trade. I have a little more to say. I'll leave this here for now. I'll leave it deliberately open-ended and hope that some conversations to come will help us start to fill in some of the ellipses in my argument and get us on the road to something really actionable, because action needs to be the outcome of conversations like this. I will turn it over to Petrina.
Thank you so much for inviting me here, and thank you for your remarks, Lorne, because some of the two last things that you talked about, the Diverse Voices Fellowship and the ABAA paid internship, that's heartening to hear. You know, and the whole role of being proactive instead of reactive, that's, yeah, 100% agree with you with that. So I'm going to share my screen, and the bulk of my talk, or my remarks, essentially are made up of ideas, so of going forward. So I'm going to, can you all see that easily?
Yes.
Okay, good. So a couple weeks ago, recording and visual artist Solange made available rare and out-of-print books by Black creators available online. If you all aren't familiar with who Solange is, she's the little sister of Beyonce, but she is a recording artist in her own right as well. So I'm going to read the first two paragraphs of this article about her work in doing this. So let's see. So since its founding in 2013, the creative studio run by musical and visual artist Solange has produced otherworldly performance art, podcasts, and video installations. But its latest project might be its most ambitious. Beginning this month, the studio's website will act as a free library stocked with rare and out-of-print books by Black historians, writers, poets, and artists. The St. Heron Community Library debuted Monday, reports the Black Information Network. Through the online portal, anyone in the United States can borrow a selection of 50 art anthologies, poem collections, zines, novels, history books, and other titles curated by Rosa Duffy, founder of Atlanta Bookstore, for keeps. So Rosa Duffy, I wanted to just explore a little bit about who she is, since, Lorne was saying how there are different facets of this community. So she is one facet, and I wanted to share a little bit about her. So she is, well, maybe I should show her article so you guys can refer to that one as well. Let's see how well I am in navigating this. Let's see if it does what it's supposed to do. Hooray, it did. Okay. So this is Rosa Duffy, and she's the curator of this new online bookstore. And she is in Atlanta. And I don't know if Lorne, if she's the person you were talking about, you referred to in your remarks, but just a little bit about her. Let's see. So the idea came to Duffy in 2012 when she was a student at the Parsons School of Design in New York City. She escaped the churn of school in the city by hiding out in places like Strand Bookstore and East Village Books. Titles by Sonia Sanchez and Amari Baraka were like little life preservers in a moment when she felt adrift. And Duffy, a lifelong bibliophile, began lining the walls of her St. Mark's apartment with her favorites. But she couldn't always get her hands on the books she wanted most. For Keeps was born from that failure of the market. It's a space designed to put readers in conversation with Black writers and with ideas they'd never find in narrow African-American sections of other stores. The most obvious home for such a project was Atlanta, the so-called Black Mecca, and Duffy's own hometown. She found the perfect spot on Sweet Auburn Avenue, a strip near downtown once designated as the richest Negro street in the world, and opened the bookstore in 2018. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. Okay, so I just wanted to add too that if you're not a part of a system, obviously you create your own. And I see the same thing related to Black private archives who go directly to their communities to acquire materials instead of brokering it through rare book dealers or outside community members. And you'll probably hear more about that from our speakers to come during this panel. So Solange's online rare book library may be unusual because of her status as part of Black popular culture and because she has a means to do it. But it does address a need. So the vast majority of Black people and people of color, whether in colleges and universities or library programs, usually have no idea the path to becoming part of the rare booksellers profession as stated by Lorne as the ones dominated by white, wealthy, straight men. And because the profession has been largely associated with wealthy white elite. And after all, the now lauded Bella DaCosta Green, JP Morgan's Black librarian, she hit her race to navigate through that world. So how do we break down those barriers to joining the profession? So I have some ideas. Some you've already anticipated, but I'd like to share a few more. So first, rare booksellers must have to feel there's an incentive to do this kind of work. If you don't feel compelled to do it because you won't personally pay a cost to make more inclusive, DEI efforts won't work. I see that all the time in all the various workplaces that I've been in. If it's of no consequences to library leadership, or in fact, white people who make up the majority of the workplace, it's not gonna happen. So they have to embrace it, or not even embrace it, buy into it in some way and to act on it. But how do we do that? And part of it is folks need to do their homework, because there's a lot of literature out there that deals with being aware of your own implicit and explicit biases. And I think a lot of times people want to jump into this kind of work without having to do that kind of self-reflection. And oftentimes that you'll run into trouble in doing that, and not just you run into trouble, the people of color that you work with run into trouble because create an environment that may not feel safe for them if you have no awareness of your own implicit or explicit biases. So another idea is to take classes from Rare Book School and the California Rare Book School, that classes that are taught by and focus on people of color. For instance, like the African-American print cultures in the 19th century United States by Derek Spires, who's a professor at Cornell University. He taught a rare book school, that rare book school course this summer, and it had great reviews according to Twitter. And Why Black Bibliography Matters by Kenahai Nashikawa. And forgive me if I've mispronounced its name. And also developing, and that was this summer at Rare Book School in Virginia, and developing and administering ethnic and cultural heritage collections by Tamar Doherty. And she taught that virtually through California Rare Book Schools. I think that it's really important to take courses, not that courses that are taught by people who are outside of the culture aren't valuable when they're talking about people of color, but I think that it's really valuable when you have someone who's a cultural insider who's teaching a course from that cultural insider perspective. And another idea is to implement systemic partnerships with ACRL, RBMS, and other related organizations to create workshops or classes or mini apprenticeships / fellowships, just happening, especially for underrepresented populations on book trade work, such as like, so you want to be a rare bookseller, or exploring the relationship between booksellers and collectors and special collections. If these were things in regular rotation, like at RBMS sessions, or even we know now that we don't have to wait till an RBMS conference and everything to have these kinds of things, it would break down some of the barriers. And it doesn't just have to be RBMS, but I'm the current past chair of RBMS, so I'm going to kind of look out for it. So there is also a network of bookstores run by people of color. And I think it would be great to identify and connect with them to talk about the possibility of expanding their reach into rare books. Everybody may not want to do that, but there are already, you know, people, the brick and mortar places and online, and who also do online work that are on the ground who maybe, you know, don't know a lot about the rare book world, and it could expand their selection of materials, kind of in the way that Rosa Duffy's doing in Atlanta. And also connect with library schools or institutions with larger populations of underrepresented students. And this seems to be the ABAA is doing this with HBCUs. So places like Moreland Spingarn at Howard University, the Atlanta Center, with the Spelman, Morehouse, Clark Atlanta, and the North Carolina Central State University. We hold virtual programs on the path to rare book dealership. This, you know, could reap some rewards. And it may require, of course, grants and everything in order to create a larger, more extensive program with this. And another thing is to, for people, and this is probably the most difficult thing, is to widen your professional networks to include more than your own homogenous communities, because the US is incredibly segregated in every way, in every walk of life, including personal and professional networks. But if you who are already in the profession only communicate or network or give opportunities to people you know, nothing will change. So all these ideas require proactivity and to get out of the talking stage and actually go into the doing stage. And where there is a commitment to actually do the work instead of pondering on it, we'll really start to see a change. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'm next. Before starting, I just wanted to say that I'm going to be turning off my my video just because my internet tends to be a little weird. So it's better for me to turn that off. So I'm going to share my screen. And then please let me know if you're able to see this.
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me start from the beginning. Here we go. So thank you, like everyone else, I'm happy to be part of this panel and to discuss more deeply the role of diversity and community in our respective fields. As already mentioned, my name is Lizeth Ramírez. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I'm Mexican-American and fall within the larger Latinx community. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. The greater Los Angeles area is on the traditional lands of the Gabrielino, Tongva, Chumash, Fernandino, Tataviam, and Serrano peoples. I acknowledge their presence here since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. Before I begin my prepared remarks, I do want to say that I'm fairly new to academic libraries and to interacting with the rare book world. The bulk of my experience has been in public libraries, working directly with community, so that really informs the way I view my role as a librarian, archivist, and curator. So my approach to today's panel and discussion was to first discuss my current position at UCLA and how it centers community collaboration, then discuss how I approach community-centered work that promotes diversity. I will also introduce a project that I and colleagues at UCLA are working on. And finally, I'm gonna make some considerations that I think all of us as librarians, archivists, booksellers, and collectors should explore further. My official title at the Library Special Collections at UCLA is Librarian Archivist for Los Angeles Communities and Cultures. It's a new position that was created in 2019. They actually hired 2 of us for this position, myself and Delana Hunter, as they understood that the work focusing on Los Angeles communities and cultures was a massive undertaking. We do focus on LA, but we also do include Southern California. So as you can imagine, it's kind of a huge area with a lot of communities that represent different cultures and languages. Previous work focusing on collecting Los Angeles were dependent on temporary library positions and limited projects. So while Library Special Collections was collecting around Los Angeles, there was no permanent position dedicated to this. And anytime we lost a librarian or a project ended, we would lose all knowledge gained by individuals filling these positions or managing these projects. By creating the position of Librarian Archivist for Los Angeles Communities and Cultures, UCLA Library Special Collections was acknowledging the need to focus on the diverse communities in Los Angeles that were previously excluded from our collections. There needed to be dedicated staff to this area of collecting. They also took care to structure this position in a way that clearly indicated our desire to collaborate with communities and to center them in our work. This included the title of the position itself. When I first started, there was a lot of discussion about why we weren't just called Curators for Los Angeles, or why our project wasn't just called Collecting Los Angeles. And the answer was that we wanted to make sure that communities knew that we weren't there to dictate how collections might be brought into the library, or that we would dictate how collaborative projects would work. Instead, the hope is that the title Librarian Archivist for Los Angeles Communities and Cultures conveys that we work for the community. My first steps began with establishing clear collecting priorities. These collecting priorities are meant to guide my work and to serve as a framework for my efforts. My actual collecting priorities are 3 pages long, but I'm going to highlight just some parts of it right now. My priorities include working with Latinx and Central American communities, specifically communities from El Salvador and Guatemala. I'm also interested in working with LGBTQ+ communities, and I'm interested in social justice movements, as well as Los Angeles culinary and food culture. In order to be transparent about these priorities, they are made available online through the UCLA Library Special Collections website, and I also make them available to communities where possible. Once the priorities were established, my next step was to figure out what we already had in our collections that were related to the communities I'm interested in collaborating with. Existing collections can be used in a variety of ways when approaching communities. First, they can signal our interest in their communities. For example, if we have broadsides from the Mexican Revolution in our collection, it reinforces our interest in the community histories of Mexican Americans in Los Angeles as a continuation of that larger cultural history. In the case of Central American communities where we might not have much in our collections, we can point to materials about Mexican American communities to demonstrate the type of collections or projects we want to build with them. We also want to encourage use of collections by the community. Currently, we're closed because of the pandemic to the public. We're only allowing students and faculty to come into the library, but generally we are open to the public. Often the public doesn't know that they're actually allowed to come to the library and look at our materials. So that's something that we hope to share with the community so that they know that they can come in and that these collections are there for their use as well. And finally, and I think that the most important part of my job is community outreach and relationship building, which is actually really difficult to quantify. In my experience, the most important thing to do when you're trying to establish relationships with communities is to show up and be consistent. This means going out to the community, learning about existing historical societies or cultural organizations, showing up to events. And when I talk about like showing up, it just means showing up, like maybe introducing yourself, letting them know that you're here, that you're from UCLA, that you are interested in their history without right away saying that you want something from them. You also want to collaborate with public libraries who are already part of their community because they usually already have, connections to those communities and also have previously worked with organizations. And then one of the really important things I think that I found in establishing relationships with communities is not to promise more than you can give and to set expectations. So as it was mentioned previously, I was at a public library and I managed a local history collection for over 10 years. And so by the end of that, I had a lot of really good connections to the community. And so a lot of my work was very easy to do towards the end. But that was because, you know, I put in the time early on over years to develop relationships with organizations and with community members so that they understood that I was there to help them with their efforts to archive their own communities and to preserve that history without being proprietary about it. So one of the projects that we're starting out right now is an archival outreach and to-go kit program or project. Obviously, this was interrupted by the pandemic, but the idea here is that because we want to do a lot of outreach work, we wanted to have supplies and materials that would facilitate this work. As you know, UCLA, I don't know if you're familiar with the campus, but it's in LA, it's not easy to get to. Parking is horrible. Traffic is horrible. So one of the things that we want to do is go out to the community to meet them where they're at. So this means going out to events. So, you know, having booths and tables at events. So this would be like this past weekend, we participated in the Archives Bazaar at USC, which is an event where local institutions with archival collections set up tables, and then we're open to the public so they can learn about our collections. So we'll attend events like that. There's also community-based events, like there's a jazz festival that happens every year in LA in a neighborhood that was once a historic African-American community. So we go to these events in order to let people know that we're out there, that we're interested in their history, and that we do have collections that they can look at and use for their own purposes. Something else that we wanted to create materials for was for community workshops. When I worked at a public library, one of the things that was most important and most interesting to people was to learn about how they themselves could preserve their own photographs and collections. So we would have these workshops where we taught them how to do that. So in this case, our archival to-go kits would include, you know, documentation about how you would do so, maybe some folders and some sleeves so that they could store their photographs. I also used to do a lot of presentations around house history because the area that I worked in had historic homes. So we would teach them how to research our collections in order to get that information. So that's kind of the type of outreach we want to do as well by presenting workshops to the community. There's also community-led archiving kits. So this is when we seek to collaborate with and empower communities and individuals to archive their history and experiences for their own use. So when we would provide them with supplies for this, it might include boxes, file folders. We also do have like flash drives if items are digitized. We also have audio recorders if they want to do oral histories, etc. So we would let them borrow these materials, give them some materials, and then also help them in their efforts to collect community history. Aside from that, we would also have offsite displays and exhibits, offsite speaking engagements. And so for these, it would just be, you know, supplies that would enable us to do this work, and then also just information to hand out to people that would lead them back to us if they had more questions. And then finally, and most importantly, is post-custodial archival assistance. So this is a type of kit that would include items and supplies that would enable me to aid organizations, community groups, and our individuals to organize their own collections for research or use. And this is for when they're going to keep their own collections and not bring them into the library. So a lot of the items in this kit would also be kept by them. And then we would facilitate that work and help them not just organize their collections, but also provide access to it by letting our researchers and our students know that there are collections in the community that exist that they can also access. And finally, I do have some considerations for booksellers, collectors, and librarians. I know everything I spoke about before was very specific to the type of work that I do, but I think there's probably examples and things that we do that can be applied for booksellers and collectors and in the rare book field. And so the first thing I think is to acknowledge our own limitations. I did mention that I'm Mexican-American and I fall within the Latinx community. I do speak Spanish, so usually that does facilitate some of that work. But when I was creating my collection priorities, one of the things I really wanted to do was make sure that people knew that while I was interested in Latinx communities, I really was interested in specifically Central American communities, including Guatemala and El Salvador. And that's because often when you think about Latin American communities or Latin American history, it centers around Mexican Americans or Chicano populations. And oftentimes that excludes some of our Central American communities. And so in those cases, I want to make sure that they know that we're interested in their collections, and that even though I do speak Spanish, and so that kind of gives me some facility into that world, those cultures are different. And I think it's important to respect that there are going to be those differences and to reach out to communities and center them as experts, because obviously they're going to know more about their own communities and their own cultures than I would, even if we do share a language. Something else I think that is important for us in the book world is to ask the following questions. And so this first question I pulled from Dusting for Fingerprints, Introducing Feminist Standpoint Appraisal by Michelle Caswell. And it's what records do not exist that should. And we really kind of found this question interesting and useful for our work as curators in library special collections. And it really makes us think about not just what we're missing in local history, in our archives, but why these records don't exist and why they don't exist in our archives. I think we sometimes imagine that, some communities might not keep materials or they don't exist, but they actually do exist. They just don't exist in our academic fields. So I think it's important to think about those records that do not yet exist. And this could also include, when things happen and there's no textual proof, which is usually what we, operate in, thinking about, oral history projects, et cetera, of ways that we can create some of these records. And the other question too is if we are to acquire this particular collection, who is left out? And I think this question specifically is really important for archives and also for booksellers, because we get to choose, and we really do have a direct influence in what ends up in archives. And it's important to think about, if we're acquiring a collection, by a Central American community, from Guatemala, who might we be ignoring in that? So you might have a collection from Guatemala that focuses on Spanish speakers, but they also do have indigenous populations. And what about those collections, and how can we work to include those communities that are also excluded when we're thinking of acquiring collections for sale or for archives? And then finally, also centering and involving the community in transactions. I know it's a lot more difficult for booksellers, but I'll give you one example. We worked recently with Johnson Rare Books and Archives here in LA. And we bought a collection from them that was really interesting. And because they knew that the collection was interesting to us, first of all, obviously they wanted us to buy the collection, but they also made it possible for us to contact the creators of the collection in case you wanted to follow up with more questions, which was great because, with that collection, we really did want to do an oral history with the person who created those materials. So I think that was a really generous action, because it can be a little difficult for vendors to say, I'm going to connect you to the people that we bought this collection to and then sold it to you. I know there can be questions about, letting them know how much we paid for the collection, et cetera, but those are all things that we can discuss with booksellers in our efforts to contact those communities that created those original records. And then finally, I just wanted to end this on saying that everything that we're doing to center communities in our collections and to promote diversity is going to take time. I think now is the time to commit to making a commitment to diversity and centering communities, but it will take time to get everyone on board, not just stakeholders, but also the communities that we hope to work with. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Lisbet.
Hello. Changing my view here. So
first of all, I want to thank Cait and Cait for inviting me to this panel. At the time when she made the invitation, I was like, what do I have to add here? And she just reminded me of, you know, the symbiotic relationship between collector and antiquarian bookseller. And as I'm listening to these comments, first of all, I really realized that whereas at one point I was the new kid on the block and the youngin' in the community, I realize now that the era in which I came up really impacts my relationship to this, and things that were true in my day are no longer true, as is evidenced by this panel. So yeah, just a little of my backstory en route to, I would say, making a nice living as a collector archivist, which is no small feat. I was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. I came up in Berkeley in the 60s, which I would liken it as the golden era of collecting. Everybody collected. You know, everybody I know, we had a comic book collection, baseball card collection. Our parents collected blue chip and S&H stamps. Virtually every trip to the gas station resulted in some sort of collectible. So collecting became one of my ways of interacting with the world. And in some weird twist of fate, the closest store to where we lived was Dave's Hobby Shop, that literally set the entire neighborhood's kids up for lifetimes of imprudent financial decisions. So I shudder to think just how many baseball cards were sacrificed on the altar of our bicycle spokes. So yeah, curating, which was a word I probably would not even know until much later. My skills were honed, you know, curating my little collections. And as I grew up, my collecting activity evolved from pop culture to political posters. A trip to Cuba in 1985, I stumbled across a trove of old OSPAL posters and started me off on a lifelong love of political graphics and old paper, which Lorne knows a thing or two about my love of old paper. I'm one of his best clients. So yeah, I evolved from haunting hobby shops to haunting old bookstores and combing garage sales and flea markets looking for like-minded folks. And it probably wasn't until my 20s when I went to my first antiquarian book fair. And it was an almost entirely white space. I was often the only person of color, and you know, not to be denied, I kind of told myself that even though I felt like an interloper, that probably meant there was less competition for anything that I would be interested in, as if I could afford book fair prices. So, you know, I'd usually have a strategy. I'd find the directory and look to see if anybody in the index had African-American material, and would usually have to, you know, go through 9 pieces of racist stereotypes to find one thing that I would be interested in, but yet still couldn't afford. And, you know, once in a blue moon, a vendor would engage me and ask me a question like, what was I interested in? You know, giving me an opportunity to connect, but that was rare. You know, these spaces were clearly not for me, but even in these homogeneous spaces, I recognized that these were kindreds. You know, these were populated by folks who had found their tribe. You know, they were geeky kids at one time, just like me, obsessed with their collections and related pursuits. These were the spaces where they had found their community. And, you know, I wondered if perhaps there would be a place for me there someday, or alternately, would I need to help build that space where those like me could form a community where we would feel at home? I still have these discussions with my, you know, collector colleagues. So in the mid 90s, the game changed with the advent of this little thing called eBay, which allowed me to connect with collectors around the globe virtually, which meant we were no longer outliers in any space. You know, the great anonymity of online communities. I felt as freedom, because there was so much in the world of, you know, old paper and posters that lived in a place where I didn't see myself. So I started as a collector. In my 30s, I founded a Black lesbian journal called Ashe. And we published from 89 to 95, which, as fate would have it, turned out to be an incredibly rich Renaissance moment for Black LGBT culture. We worked with folks like Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith and Pat Parker. And because we were a journal, we served as a nexus for all things in Black gay communities around the world, art, literature, politics, culture. Everything went through the pages of our journal, and presciently, and related to my collecting habits, I ended up just keeping all the copious material that was coming through. And it wasn't until decades later when I started to realize, gosh, that's kind of a significant time capsule. And as I was talking to some of my antiquarian bookseller friends, they're like, that's important history, that's gold. There are institutions that would be interested in that history. And it was the first time that I really started to think about the relationship between papers and community history and all of what that entailed. And you know, I was also a little surprised to find out that this fell within the realm of antiquarian book dealers. So, you know, at that time, it was common knowledge that institutional holdings, there were such large gaps relating to histories of people of color. And I began to see a role for myself in that as someone who was active in the community. And I moved in a circle that included a lot of well-known movement figures, folks like Angela Davis and Black Panther Erica Huggins. There were lots of folks around who had clearly made history. And yet when I talked about their papers, they had no idea that they even had papers, or, you know, things like their journals and whatnot had significance. And so I began to use the skills that I developed as a kid, as a little kid collector, you know, resourcefulness, because you didn't have a lot of money, tenacity, because, you know, the first thing people are going to say is, I don't have it. Next. Yeah, so I began to be a kind of archival consultant working in developing papers of underrepresented histories. And my partners in these endeavors were antiquarian booksellers. And somewhere along the way, I recognized that the relationship had shifted somewhat because they were really hungry for this history. And yeah, one of the most interesting lessons for me is that, you know, before, when I used to think of spaces like archives and libraries and special collections and all of this as white spaces, that's no longer the case. You know, as is evidenced by some of the folks on this panel, there has been a lot of movement in this area. And while, you know, BIPOC folks are still not centered anywhere, and, you know, I feel very peripheral in a lot of spaces, we are in the room. You know, we are decision makers. We are in the room. We are making a difference. I was just looking at Lizeth's presentation about some of the archival resource kits, and that's phenomenally game changing. You know, being able to really start to address some of this by giving tools and methodology and best practices to folks who really didn't know where to begin. So I feel like at this stage, there's a lot of great places for new folks to plug in, especially recording histories and things like that, that nobody had ever really focused on. You know, it's like there are so many different communities who now have representatives who are in positions of power to make a difference. So just this past month, I returned from the East Coast, where the largest exhibit of my career, it's called Angela Davis Sees the Time, where my archive is the basis for gosh, I would call it the largest Angela Davis exhibit. It's, I've never seen anything like it. And there was a corresponding exhibit catalog, Angela Davis Sees the Time, that was published last year by German art house Hermer Verlag. And, you know, I am meeting young curators and library science majors and, you know, young BIPOC folks who just have a passion for this field and are hungry to learn how to join our ranks. You know, they're asking me, is this a hobby or potential career path? How did you get here? They want to know. So yeah, as my, you know, at 60, my collecting pursuits, you know, I've surpassed every goal I ever had as a little kid. And I'm feeling I'm more in the letting go portion of the program and thinking more about legacy and all that entails. And, you know, beyond archives and collections is the path I've been able to create my legacy. You know, what can I leave that will be of most use to those coming up behind me? These are the things that I'm thinking about. And, you know, the inevitable question that every collector comes to is like, oh my God, am I going to have to become an antiquarian bookseller? Is that the only thing that's what's left? So, yeah, I just, you know, I feel like discussions like this are really important. I will say that I'm heartened by some of the changes that I've seen, just in who's in the room, who's making decisions, whose histories are we centering. There has been tremendous movement in those areas. And while there is a long way to go, I want to also celebrate our victories because, when I look back and think of the community and the landscape that I grew up in, there are just so many more communities, so many more stories, so many more different experiences that have broadened this whole field. So yeah, I'm looking forward to some great questions, and yeah, I'm just honored to be a part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists for sharing all of this. And now I'm going to introduce the two moderators and the two people behind this panel who brought everyone together today. So with a lot of gratitude for these two. First, we have Cait Coker, who is an associate professor and curator of rare books and manuscripts at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She is the co-editor of the Women in Book History Bibliography and a senior bibliographer for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Research Database, along with Cait Mitas, who is an ABAA member and the owner of Cait Mitas Bookseller, located in Oakland, California. She specializes in women's history and social history, among other areas. So I will hand it over to the Caits.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of our incredible panelists. Y'all are just absolutely amazing. And what I would like to do, we've probably got about 20 minutes or so for questions. And then I want to leave a few minutes at the end for the panelists to come back together for some final thoughts. So if you have questions for the group, please place them in the chat. And then Cait and I will pull those out to present to our speakers. And to get started, one thing I would like to ask our panelists, and I'm thinking about this because, we've all been reading about the G20 is about to meet to discuss climate change and the energy crisis and everything. And one of the things we've all kind of been circling around today is what is individual action and what is communal action? What are the ways that we can push for organizational movements? And so I'm wondering if each of you would mind speaking to that while we start collecting questions from the audience.
Sure. Am I unmuted? Yes. Okay. Well, I'll start with just my own perspective as, on the one hand, a bookseller, and on the other hand, as the director of CABS Minnesota, which is a real stakeholder in the questions that we've been asking today, because we are sort of the point of entry to the book trade for a lot of younger booksellers. I think that booksellers, bookselling as a trade has a complicated answer to this question in terms of individual action, because assuming that you believe, as I do, that what booksellers do is important and worth doing, it only happens if booksellers make money. We have to make a profit, otherwise we don't get to do this anymore. So most individual bookseller priorities are around profit. That said, what can we do as individual booksellers to make a living, continue doing the good work that we do, and further the kinds of discussions that we're having today? And I think one very obvious one is we can begin finding ways to handle if we're handling the kind of material, the cultural heritage material that represents cultures that are not necessarily our own. The first thing we can do is take ourselves out of the picture and find ways to center that material without making it tell our story. There are so many ways to look at this material. No one needs to know what I think about it. My job is to contextualize material in such a way that it contributes to a larger narrative, a larger discussion. And I try very hard, and I know most of my colleagues try pretty hard to keep our personal experiences out of the center of that discussion. And the other thing we can do, honestly, is when we can, not all of us are in a position to hire people, but those of us who can hire people, and I'm one of them, should go out of their way whenever possible to hire people of color. Bring young booksellers into the trade. That, for years, centuries, was how people learned how to do this business, was as apprentices, or even just hanging out with their local hobby shop dealer, learning what baseball cards were worth more than others. And we are all, we all do share a geek gene. And that is a point of contact for all of us across cultures, as Lisbet put really, really beautifully, I thought. And it heartens me to think that we all have this thing in common that can help us bridge some of these gaps. And I'll say very quickly, as the director of an educational seminar, I think you have to acknowledge that institutional change doesn't happen on its own. You have to be proactive. You have to go out and recruit the people you want, and you have to make the case for why they should be interested in the first place. And we try to do that at CABS, and I think we're getting better at it all the time. I'll turn it over.
I guess I would add that it's important to go beyond the individual, although individual actions, it can take one person to change a whole thing, I acknowledge that. But there needs to be systematic change as well, institutional ones, like normalizing pathways and everything, that it's just, that it's a known factor to library school students or people in the, in the book trade or whatever, that, hey, through these different things, I can learn more about being a rare book dealer. So it's normalized. So it's not a big surprise or people won't think, I didn't even know you could do that. It needs to be systematized, just like racism is systematized. The counter needs to be systematized too, in order to, to provide push back on that. And also when these systems are created, there needs, like Lorne was saying, there needs to be people of color in positions of power, not just kind of like rank and file. There needs to be people of color in positions where they can have influence, and there needs to be more than just one, because when you have that one person who's kind of pushing all the time, they become a target because they are working out, they are trying to expand boundaries, and a lot of people get very uncomfortable when you're trying to push boundaries or to kind of reconceptualize things or make things more equitable for other people. People are used to things working in a particular way, but I've seen it time and again, and I've experienced myself that when you're the only one who's a voice, who's pushing for change, then you become the problem. And that needs to to cease.
To add to that, I've seen a lot of organizations, a lot of archival institutions create positions similar to the one that I have at UCLA. So that's something that's good to see, that's becoming more widespread. But I think echoing what Lorne and Petrina were talking about, I think it is important to see people of diverse backgrounds in all of these fields, and not just bringing them in, or kind of attracting them to these fields, but also to put them in positions of power. I mean, it's great to hear like Petrina and her new position coming up. I think that's awesome to hear about, because there's not as many people of color in positions of as directors of libraries or directors of library special collections. And while it's important that there are some of us in the field, I think to have them in positions where they can actually affect greater change is really important.
Looks like Lisbet might have stepped away for a second. So I'll go ahead and throw out the next question, which is, can people talk a little bit about, we've had questions or some thoughts about, what constitutes a collection and a collector, and how people learn to be collectors and how they come to it. And Lorne had some great thoughts about how, that there's a history to that of apprenticeships and so forth. And so can I ask y'all to talk a bit more about what are some ways to foster change in collecting, and ways that collectors can also educate booksellers and librarians that will allow them to build their collections? And Lisbet came back if you would also like to answer the previous question. Yay.
Oh, I came back hearing this question about collections, and I was like, I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's about we're kind of like also talking around the idea of like what constitutes a collection, a collector, and how people learn to be collectors, which is kind of like a historically built thing about the way people learn to be apprentices and so on. And so what are some ways to kind of foster changes in collections, or for collectors, in ways that collectors can educate booksellers and librarians that will allow them to build their collections? It's a biggie.
Can I just address this from a librarian or an archivist perspective? Because I think institutionally speaking, it really has to come with the institution. I mean, it will be a back and forth discussion, but I think that you need to have people in your institution who understand that there are gaps in collections and that they have to do reparative work in order to, because that requires you to change your collection development. That's an internal thing that needs to happen. And if it is just reliant on the collector to take on that burden, then something's very backwards about that. If I'm interpreting the question correctly, I may not be, but inside the institution, there needs to be an effort and an understanding that all collections, unless you are at a historically in a place there you have an underrepresented population that's collecting its own history, that if you're at a PWI, it's going to be gaps in the collection. It's going to be totally slanted toward white heteronormative men and the donors, as well. And I think that the folks who run those places, manage those places, have to make a decision that we are going to be collecting in areas out to fill those gaps, to represent other voices, Because quite frankly, like if you work at a PWI and you never collect another thing by a white straight man or whatever, like from this day forward, and it would still take years and years and years not to be the majority of the collections. So I feel like that needs to come from within that library. A stance needs to be made, and it needs to be made so that when a person in a position of power, when they leave, then it doesn't shift back to same as it other was, that when you leave your position, then things shift, but it becomes a part of the foundation, the framework of the collection building.
I'll also say, as someone who, I do a lot of work now bringing community collections into institutions, and there are several weak spots. For one, there are a lot of communities that don't recognize that their histories are important to record. So whereas there are certainly communities where there are people left to donate collections, and having their papers go to an institution is a natural part of their evolution. There are a lot of communities where you're starting from scratch. Once again, where I look at Lizeth's archival resource toolkit, things like that are important to even begin the act of preserving some of this history, because that's not a given. And also the road into an institution. I'm working as kind of a scout, but that's another place where, who is actively going out and looking for these collections? How do they come in? What are some of those? I feel like there needs to be a lot more exposure to this process on a community level, because there are reasons why these histories are underrepresented, and I get so many young people asking me, how do you do this? And there needs to be a lot more transparency with how that whole relationship and journey works, if that makes sense.
And it also helps to have people like Lizeth, who can go out into the community, who becomes, although of course Latinx culture is broad, like you were saying earlier, whatever, but still you are a cultural insider in many ways, and you can build relationships and trust in a way that someone who is outside, totally outside of the culture, will have a harder time in doing, or have a harder, will not have the same kind of understanding that you do. So there needs, and you can engender a sense of trust in a way that, because you're coming as, equal to equal, there's no, be it through the implicit bias of a person who's a cultural outsider, there, the hierarchy gets shifted down and everything. And I think that that's when you have people who are cultural insiders doing work and doing it in good faith and everything, then you can make really incredible differences. My only worry is the continuity of that. When positions end, or if you ever decide to leave or whatever, or if community archives fall out of favor because it's hot now, what's to happen then? There needs to be a buy-in, a commitment from the administrative levels of these institutions in order that the investment that community members have made into the institution, they don't fall away when the professional who is liaising with them may go away or whatever.
The next question we got was, how did the panelists fit the need to integrate disability into inclusion practices?
So I can talk really briefly on that, just in terms of our reading room and library special collections. You know, our reading room is really small. It's just like this really long table and it's separated, you know, and people can sit there. But we've had people come in and, you know how we usually for our reading room, we have rules like you can't bring in your own materials, we give you a pencil, here's paper. But like, for example, we one time had somebody who had trouble seeing. So for her, it was better to work with an ink pen. And so in that case, do we make exceptions, and how do we, you know, still protect our materials? And obviously when we're trying to encourage the use of our collections and make them more accessible to people, I think the more we think about how people are able to access our materials, like, you know, if they have disabilities, how we can accommodate their needs, not just in, you know, providing the space for them. I know that we're building a new instruction room. So that was one of the things that we were looking at too. Like if there's somebody who comes in and they're, you know, required to use a wheelchair, for example, how can we accommodate their use of our materials, et cetera. So I think that's something that we're starting to look at more, but it definitely is something that we have to look at generally, I think, across the field.
I'd like to go back briefly to the previous discussion, which really, as I interpreted it, was about the circulation of materials from between collector, dealer, and library. And I think something that often gets left out of this conversation because it's intimidating to some, it's considered in bad taste to others, and because it's outside the experience of others still, is money. There's a market here, and one role that the trade plays is in building and defining the markets that determine value, that allow, and without that value, material doesn't circulate. There's a reason there's no great collection of Ukrops bags in the world, because no one wants them. Well, maybe there is, I don't know, and someone will want them eventually. But right now, as far as I know, no one is out there collecting plastic grocery bags. Maybe they should be, because no one is going to pay them to do it. In the end, this work isn't free, that any of us are doing. And that goes for the community stakeholders as well. And I think that far too often, family histories, community histories get left by the wayside because no one perceived the value in keeping them. And I think Lisbet was speaking about this a lot earlier as well. And I know this is something that, well, I don't want to put words in Lisbet's mouth, but I know this is something she's dealt with over the years, you know, is kind of is navigating these markets, and they're constantly shifting. But I think we need to keep I think we need, one reason the trade exists is because, we need to keep some kind of value associated with this material to keep it circulating, to make sure that it doesn't get lost.
And we're almost at time. We've actually been getting questions through direct message, which, I'm very sorry to everyone who we've not been able to get to your questions, but to kind of like offer up final thoughts from all of the panelists. I would kind of like, someone was talking earlier about the gaps that we see. I think maybe that was Lizeth. And, what were the gaps here? Like, what is the final thought each of you would like those of us in the audience to kind of take home today?
In what order?
The order of bravery. You spoke first.
The rare book professions are for everyone. That is the message that should be taken home from this panel. And while there's no question that obstacles exist, cultural obstacles, economic obstacles, they're not insurmountable. They need to be surmounted, and we're working on it. And I'm deeply grateful to everyone who's here today for the work that they're doing.
Here's one thing that I will leave you with is that in order for structures to change, there needs to be a real sharing of power, and with historically excluded communities and everything, and people from those communities who get in positions. And things will change, I think, more if people share that power, which means that some people have to cede power. And that's the thing where people usually get stuck, because nobody wants to cede power. But that has to happen in order for structures to change, because you'll keep recreating the same structure over and over again. And there needs to be more critical mass, because the same thing will happen when you have one person.
I'll go with my takeaway. I want to address something that Lorne said about there's a reason nobody collects plastic grocery store bags. First of all, I'm pretty sure there is somebody that does collect plastic grocery store bags. And as a collector with a strong collector gene, we build these collections as labors of love, and very rarely do we do it because of any kind of market value. I mean, that was an aha moment for me, that you could actually combine the two. And what I feel needs to be prioritized is there are collections of material that exist everywhere on virtually every type of subject. And what needs to shift to me is the importance that institutions, the value of other stories and other histories that the institution places, on prioritizing their acquisitions and broadening their holdings, because all of these collections and stories and everything already exist. It's about how do we prioritize whose stories we tell, who we allocate resources towards preserving, those sorts of things. So those are all conversations that happen in your offices, in your rooms, because the little independent collectors like me, we're doing what we do because somehow we're driven to, and we have this gene, and we've tried to be talked out of it, and our moms were yelling at us for spending the money, and we did it anyway. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I think my takeaway is just really basically to acknowledge that everything is going to take time, that we do have to make the choice to center communities and to focus on diversity, and to know that in that process, we're going to make mistakes as we go. But those are opportunities to come out the other side, and hopefully building archives that are more inclusive of all the stories that are out there. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this really incredible conversation, very informational talk, and a big thank you to all of our panelists and moderators. If anyone who's joining in the meeting, if you'd like to unmute and come on, turn your camera on and say thank you out loud, that's also allowed at this time. But we so appreciate you being here, and look forward to having more conversations like this. It's not a one-time thing, and something we'll continue to work on together and individually. So be safe, everyone. Have a good rest of the day, and hopefully see everyone soon on Zoom or in person.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.